Good morning. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. Welcome to the forum, it's our second to last session for the spring forum. The Abortion Talks is a documentary film about the secret dialogues that took place between pro-life and pro-choice leaders in the Boston area in the wake of shootings that left employees dead at 2 clinics in 1994. Disillusioned by the rhetoric and posturing from both sides, 3 pro-life and 3 pro-choice leaders met secretly to see if together they could fix their broken worlds. As the timely, relevant title indicates, on one level, this film is about the complex topic of abortion. But on a much deeper level, what this film is really about is showcasing the power of dialogue to replace dangerous and divisive stereotypes, strategies, and rhetoric with empathy, tolerance, and genuine friendship. Directed by Perkins and Josh Sabey, whose 2019 film American Tragedy won Best Documentary at the Boston Film Festival, it is a powerful, true, and timely story of 6 women and how their brave decision to meet changed their lives. Today, we'll be talking about the story behind their covert meetings, the abortion debate then and now, and finding common ground across our deepest divides. Josh and Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, we're glad to be here.
Yeah. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you first heard this story about these activists who began meeting in secret and bridging this big divide.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit to that. So, honestly, we were concerned with polarization in the country, and I was actively, at this time, looking for a story that could get to the heart of it or give us some hope or something. I was just looking for something that also would be engaging enough that people would want to watch it, honestly. Like, it wouldn't just be a boring, like, kumbaya, people getting together, being happy. You know, like, I wanted a story that really could communicate. And we went through several stories and just didn't think they had the legs. And then my brother sent me an article that was published in 2001 in the Boston Globe. And it was an article written by these 6 women. And it told their story of meeting together. But it's just an amazing story, but it was pretty much buried in history. It didn't have a very long life because several reasons, which I guess you can learn about in the film maybe. But it's just this remarkable story that just hasn't been told. And we realized this was our story we needed to tell.
Yeah. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about your first impression of these women when you first met them? What kind of stood out about them when you first talked to them?
Yeah, so onboarding the women was difficult. It had happened so long ago and we were strangers emailing out. But a few things stood out. So we started filming right as COVID had sort of finished peaking and we were starting to come out of it. But for several of these women, we were the first people in their homes since COVID had happened. And I think that felt like a really remarkable experience because we were able to come into their homes after a long period of isolation and sit down with them for many hours and collect their stories, which felt almost sacred, I think, that opportunity. And the other thing that stood out to me is just all of the women were just remarkably warm and personable, but had really impressive resumes. You know, Barbara Thorpe, she was the leader of the ProLife office for the Archdiocese of Boston. After she finished that work, she went on and became the sort of head social worker for the victim outreach for the Archdiocese of Boston towards for victims of clergy abuse. And then when she finished that work, she became one of the head social workers for victim outreach for the Boston Marathon bombing. So like women with really, really remarkable resumes. And almost all of them said that this dialogue was the most profound experience of their lives, some of the most sacred work that they did.
Oh, that's amazing. And one of the things that's interesting to me is just your choices just about the genre. I mean, so there is that kind of true crime feeling in it. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that artistic decision and how you made decisions about what the feeling of the film was going to be.
Yeah, so one thing we wanted to accomplish with the film was we didn't want to make a film about polarization that no one would watch except for people that already cared about polarization. Right? It needed to have legs to compete in a competitive media market. And so actually the true crime element was really important because that's what a lot of people watch. And it gives it tension, it gives it, you're not watching this like, oh, I should probably watch this. It's really engaging and you want to watch it. And that's what we think we needed to be able to compete in the media market so that people actually watch this and actually get the message.
Yeah. Were there did you see them interacting together very much or was it mostly one-on-one interviews in people's homes?
We saw them, both and, So we did all the interviews in their homes, but we saw them on Zoom calls together. We planned to launch together in October, where they all met together. And then we screened the film. The first time the women saw the film all together was a week after the Dobbs decision came down.
Oh, wow.
So we were pretty apprehensive going into that meeting, as I'm sure you can imagine.
That was amazing because in a lot of ways their roles sort of switched, right?
Right.
And they actually were amazing at how they talked and how respectful they were to each other. But yeah, there was definitely some tension there at that screening.
Back in the time when they first, maybe you can talk a little bit about just the impetus for these meetings. So John Sabey went and murdered people at 2 different abortion clinics. The trial was front page, is on the news everywhere. And the Archdiocese is saying, gosh, this reflects so badly on pro-choice, on pro-life people. So how did these 2 groups of women begin to kind of make contact and first explore the possibility of having these secret meetings?
Yeah, so there had been some sort of vague calls for common ground talks between Governor William Weld, and Bernard Law, the bishop, or Cardinal.
Cardinal Law, yeah.
Cardinal Law. And they met together on television in this big televised broadcast, and they shook hands and said see, people from opposing viewpoints can come together. And then Nikki, I think probably pretty precisely says, men often have ideas and then women do the work. And so
that was one of the best parts of the film.
Yeah, it's great. And so after that, Laura Chasen,
yeah,
and Susan Podziva, the 2 moderators of the dialogue, started meeting with all of these different leaders of these movements, of these organizations, and started winnowing down to these 6 women, and invited these 6 women to participate in these dialogues with a strict confidentiality agreement. They were not to talk about it with anybody besides their spouses. And then they had the first meeting in September.
And I'll just add, I think there was a real desire to do the meeting because publicly, right, they were worried about optics. They had all these things they had to consider, as representatives of a movement. But they really, I think, had a real desire to just meet and talk and understand each other without all of that pressure, without all of that rhetoric, and without all of that, without all those onlookers. So they met secretly, and that was really important. It had to be completely secret. They didn't tell anyone about these meetings. As a matter of fact, this is in the film, but Franz, was it her secretary, thought she was having an affair because she kept sneaking away to these secret meetings because they really didn't tell their own movements about it. It was completely secret.
What was the first? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, there was one moment when Madeline McComish, somebody in her organization, said it had gotten out that maybe these secret meetings were happening, and somebody in Madeline McComish, the president of Mass Citizens for Life, said, Mass Citizens for Life had better not be participating in these meetings. And Madeline said, Mass Citizens for Life is not, because it was written in the contract that you are not coming as a representative of your organization, you're coming as yourself. Yeah.
What was that first meeting like? And then what framework did they use for running the meetings?
Yeah, so we were lucky enough so these meetings were all recorded. The audio was recorded.
Right.
We were lucky enough to probably listen through most of them. So I heard that first meeting. I didn't get to see it, which would have been awesome to see it. But I got to hear that first meeting. And it was, as you can imagine, they walked in, it was very tentative, very hi. They had never talked before. They had seen each other on TV, but now they're actually meeting the people, and so there was a lot of just that sort of small talk, hi, getting to meet each other, and then right away it became very structured. The moderators really structured it so that they didn't have to guess their way through. They were given real intentional tasks that allowed them to deal with really complex issues and to talk about it.
What's an example of an intentional task? I know that the nomenclature, the language that you use, what do we call, an unborn baby, a human fetus, those kinds of things. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the work that they had to do.
I'll talk a little bit about that, and then if you want to add on. So in the movie, Fran talks a little bit about this. She's one of the women, and she says, we had to figure out a language to talk to each other because so many of these words were loaded, one way or the other. And so you brought up fetus or unborn child, those were like how the different sides referred to, what was in a woman's belly that was aborted. They use abortion. I can't remember what terms, but it was really hard to even talk about the issues without setting someone off or upsetting someone. So they came to a compromise of what to use there. What was it? It was
human fetus.
Human fetus, yeah. Human fetus is what they agreed because they thought that maintained the sacredness of what was there, but also was scientific. So that's what they agreed to, and they said no one loved it, but it was good enough. They were able to communicate, and that's just one small thing, and that was multiplied 100 times over. They said they had hundreds of words that they agreed not to use, and they just were really careful and came to a language. And that was several of the first meetings were just developing that language so that they could communicate.
Yeah, and it seems so simple, right? Finding a language with which to discuss the issue that they disagree about. But I think that's actually a really profound accomplishment. You think about how the two extremes in the political spectrum can't really talk to each other because they use totally different words. And even the words that they share mean totally different things. Patriotism means very different things in different parts of the nation. And so the ability to co-author a language with which they could discuss a thing about which they disagree in a way that they could actually understand what they're saying, I think is a huge product of this dialogue that had real waves beyond the basement.
And I might add that I do think this is necessary in some of these really intractable issues. I don't think you would walk away from this movie and think, there's no way you can ever talk to anyone that you disagree with without forming a whole language, right? It's not always this hard, but these were leaders of movements with all of this entrenched rhetoric, and there was a lot of work. And maybe it's necessary depending on the issue.
Yeah, and I mean, even the words pro-life and pro-choice, anti-abortion, all those words are they're disputed words. So I can imagine. And I mean, one of the things I thought was interesting is the film implies, too, that just the way that the women talked as spokespeople after the dialogues was influenced by this. And I wonder if you can just give examples of that or describe how that
Yeah,
was.
absolutely. So when we were working on the film, we were also going through archival newspapers from the Boston Globe, especially during this time. And we actually came across an article where Madeline McComish, the president of Mass Citizens for Life, came out very publicly saying, we're no longer going to refer to our opposition as abortion advocates. That's not what they want to be called. We're going to call them pro-choice as per their preference. So that's one example. Another great example is also Madeline McComish sort of oversaw the communications that they would put out and op-eds and such. And so Nikki Nichols Gamble, the president of Planned Parenthood Massachusetts, had written an op-ed in the Globe. And somebody from Mass Citizens for Life had written a counter opinion that they wanted to publish as an op-ed. Madeline read the counter opinion and said, that's not what Nikki said. You're not responding to what she said. And the writer said, well, you don't have to tell me what she said. I know what she said. And Madeline said, well, I don't believe you're responding to what she said. Therefore, this isn't going to go out. And there's lots of little examples like that of sort of public impacts of this very, very private dialogue. The one other thing I want to bring up is another article headline that we had found searching through the Globe before they had ever gone public with this dialogue said, has anyone's opinions changed on abortion? Maybe not, but the rhetoric has. And so I think there was this recognition publicly that something had changed that had impacted the way that they were addressing each other in the public space, even before they knew the cause of it.
I do think that's really amazing that they recognized, the impacts were noticed before they even knew how it happened. And that's how so much of this work happens. So much of this bridge building work is hidden work. It's not public. It's not exciting often. It's not, it's just not full of rhetoric and, come protest with, it's the opposite. In some ways it's soft, it's careful, it's intentional, but it's really crucial and really impactful.
So this happened in just a relatively small world. I mean, Boston is called the hub, and the hub, the circle, the wheel is New England.
Yeah.
And so there was a way in which news media was very different in the 1990s. It was a small region where you could actually have leaders meet with one another. What do you do when you're talking about a much larger system and new technologies? How can we make use of the things that we learned in these dialogues, in the polarization that we experience right now?
Well, I'll just say that these meetings, were run by, what was it called before it was Essential Partners? It was
the Public Conversations Project.
Public Conversations Project, which was one of the first bridge-building organizations. And through these meetings, they pioneered several, I guess, methods for bridge building. And these have grown. Like, this really was, in a lot of ways, you talk about spokes and wheels, this was like a central moment that sort of has gone out, and now there are, like, across the country, there are 500 or more organizations that deal with bridge building. And almost all of them can be tied back to what happened here. So just the power of what happened in these meetings that has now, grown to 500 organizations across the country that are doing the bridge building work. And a lot of that bridge building work, like you said, is like, in this church, that congregation, that workplace, like all these little places. But some of them are broader and with leaders of across the country. And there's a lot of different organizations doing a lot of different work. And it's work that we all need to think, how can we help that work? How can we be a part of that work? And what can we do to help it?
Yeah. The San Francisco Interfaith Council has like rules about how to pray in public, for instance, like accepted practices, and I think it's very helpful. It just allows us to each express ourselves fully, it really is good, and it's all clarified ahead of time. But I can imagine, and each one is totally unique to its own region. The interfaith group that's on the peninsula has a totally different feeling, a totally different way of functioning.
I think you need that, right? Like, you need those that local work needs to be done. But then there's also a place for global and national work.
And I think that's why some places are going to be more important in the future too, because there are places that are just more homogeneous in terms of the politics of the people in that region.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big problem. You assume often I think we assume the takeaway is like, go talk to your neighbor, but that's becoming more unlikely that you'll find a neighbor who thinks very differently than you do.
I mean, it's funny because for the first time in my adult life, I began having friends who were leaving California for political reasons to go and be places where there were more people who had their viewpoints. Yeah,
and that's been documented, how we're really becoming more and more isolated, even within neighborhoods. Like, certain neighborhoods have certain political beliefs, and that's a problem. And there's organizations dealing with that. But yeah, that's a real problem. And I guess that's one thing I think this film is, in some ways, is a message to leaders, because these were all leaders. These weren't just, like in this story at least, these weren't just random person on the street talking with someone they disagree with. These were leaders of organizations. And they all took away from this lessons that they used in their own organization. So Nikki in the movie talks about how she thinks that the most fundamental responsibility of a leader is understanding the differences of opinions around you. Because in all of our workplaces, no matter how homogenous we are politically or whatever, there's still lots of differences and lots of, even political differences. So there's that even within their own movements, right? Like, Nikki realized that within her own organization, there was a huge diversity of opinions, and that just attuning herself to that helped her be a better leader and helped her get value out of that difference instead of that difference becoming a stumbling block that tripped up the organization.
Well, and I think it's validating, too, to be able to recognize your own nuances and belief. The Reverend Ann Fowler, who participated in these dialogues, she was a pro-choice Episcopal priest. She said that in doing the dialogue, she realized that she was very adamantly opposed to abortion for the sake of gender selection, which is something that she'd never realized or never felt capable of expressing until she was put in an environment where authentically held beliefs you were supposed to express them as your own authentically held belief and to deal with it and to grapple with it. And so I think it's important to provide that both for the sake of having sort of pluralistic organizations, but also so that you can discover things about yourself and realize and understand your own opinions in ways that I think you're not often pushed to recognize.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because there's so many times at the end of the film, people say, well, none of us changed our minds about anything. We're still, but really, I mean, that's an example of actually changing your mind about something, having a more nuanced position than you might have otherwise had. Mm-hmm. The fact that there were all women in this group, can you tell us a little bit about what that dynamic was and why that was maybe different than if men had been participating in it?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So they had done smaller dialogues before this one. This is what they call this one the flagship dialogue. And in the smaller ones prior to this one, they had male participants. So there's a reality there that had happened and it had gone, as far as I understand, well enough. And there's this other reality that all of the participants in this dialogue indicated that they don't think it would have been possible if a man had been involved. That something about the dynamic of all women sitting together was powerful and essential to the success of the conversations.
Yeah, I think they felt like there was something like a women's work going on.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of Against Literary Darwinism, an essay by Olivia Frey, who talks about how there's a womanist rhetoric that tends to be devalued in public spaces, but that's actually really essential to a functioning, healthy society that tends to be more backgrounded, less aggressive, less abrasive, but does really important sort of bedrock work in building pluralism and tolerance and appreciation of diverse modes of address and perspectives. Yeah.
I'm totally got to read that.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just say, the other thing about the women there is this is just sort of what they had, right? Like, in a lot of ways, at the very beginning, they kind of thought, I wish we had some men here. I wish we had more diversity here, because they were all white women. They're like, we really should have more diversity. But these were the leaders. Like, these were the 6 leaders, like the 6 main leaders in the field, and they just decided that they had to start, and this is sort of the state of affairs. This is who was leading the organizations. And like they talk about how Cardinal Law, who sort of was a spokesperson in some ways, was not the leader in the area. Like, the leaders of the movements were these women. And oftentimes the people on TV were men talking about it. But these were the actual leaders that actually ran the organizations. And so that was just sort of who they had, who was leading. And
I think in that sense, the dialogue was a way of reclaiming the rhetoric on a women's issue by women in what often publicly, I think, was sort of a male-dominated discourse.
Yeah, I mean, the film that you show of Governor Weld and Cardinal Law together, I mean, here these two people who, in maybe the public eye or the media's eye, are these big authorities, but it's an authority that they've seized. They're not recognized by their institutions as having that power.
Yeah, exactly.
With the Supreme Court decision, maybe you can talk a little bit about how that changed the women's perspective of what it was that they had been doing, years earlier.
This recent Dobbs decision, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's a moment in the film where one of the pro-life people is talking about how this was just kind of good for her movement to kind of like legitimize the movement, help people to be able to hear her message a little bit better. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what it means after Dobbs.
I can say a little bit about what we witnessed when we watched the film with these women, and the pro-life women were very worried about the pro-choice women. They said, we don't feel exultant. We don't feel like what we feel right now is we want to care for you. We want to make sure you're okay. And we want to provide, support to you. And that was pretty amazing, because I think they felt like this was a big victory. It wasn't that they didn't care about the issue. But what was worrying them, because they had been on the other side of it. They had been where the Supreme Court was against them. And they knew what that felt like and how hard it was. And they expressed multiple times just sort of concern for the pro-choice women who were going through this.
Yeah, and they express that within their movements as well. All of them are still very involved in the movements. And they had spoken out to the current presidents, the current board members of their pro-life movements, that what our main task at this point needs to be is to repair, is to reach out and to, repair those relationships and show sympathy and empathy of what is obviously a deeply disappointing decision.
And they were also really concerned about women. Like, they realized that laws aren't caught up to this, that there's going to be people that aren't going to get what they need, that they needed to be there, to support those women.
Sorry, which I think does speak to the sort of legacy of this dialogue, that it complicated their position, where simply like winning in the Supreme Court wasn't wasn't the prize, right? Like there was more work to be done, and a recognition that a lot of that work involved reaching across the aisle.
You mentioned Ann Fowler as an Episcopal priest who was involved in this. She did have like an institutional authority in the church. I wonder if you can talk about her like unique contribution to the dialogue and just your experience of her as a person.
You want me to talk?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. When you first meet Ann Fowler, you realize that she's like a force of nature. She's someone who's got opinions, and she's going to share those opinions. But then, just a little bit down the road, you realize that she is a very concerned person. Now, throughout this whole process, she was our biggest advocate. She was the one that got all the other women on board. She was the one who, tried to help us get connections, tried to help us get in contact with all these different people. Like, she was the one that was advocating for this because she has so much, I think, what's the word? I don't know, I'm looking for a word. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, she was there for us, and she's abrasive a little bit. But she's so wonderful, and I just think that one of the amazing things about this is that all these women were so different, not just in their political beliefs, but they were just different in how they went about talking, who they were, and yet they became deep friends who respected each other.
Yeah. So I actually didn't get to Anne's was the only interview I didn't get to attend because I was in class. And Josh had sent a video ahead of Josh and I making the pitch for making the movie to the women. And Anne was talking about Josh with it, and she was like, I liked you in that video, but I didn't like the Seraph character.
She didn't know we were married at that time.
She had no idea that we were married.
I can imagine her saying that.
Didn't know what to say to that. I was like, I like her.
There's so much. I feel like just watching this, it was just like so timely, and I just wonder what kind of practical lessons do we draw in terms of addressing polarization as we are. I was at the National Dean's Conference last week, and so went to the Congress and the Supreme Court building, and it really feels different after the January 6th insurrection. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just what we can learn from this film in terms of helping to kind of to be better listeners to each other.
Yeah, Josh talked about how this work was sort of hidden work, right? It took place in a windowless basement under strict confidentiality. When they did go public, it was buried pretty fast. And recently, in regards to the film, I've been thinking of one of my favorite quotes from a book called Middlemarch, written by George Eliot, a Victorian female writer. And it concludes, the growing good of the world is largely dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me is half owing to the number who has lived faithfully a hidden life and who rest in unvisited tombs. And I think that's true. I think so much of what makes civilizations, societies, communities, neighborhoods work is this very sort of hidden, unremarkable, but faithfully maintained work of maintaining relationships, having conversations with people you disagree with, whether or not you come to common ground, of reaching out, of trying to make space for people that are different than you, that believe differently than you. And it's often exhausting work. I think Ann Fowler said that this conversation was one of the hardest things she's ever done. And it's work that goes on for a long time. There's not an end in sight here. But it's the sort of unhistoric, hidden, unremarkable work that we all need to be thinking about and engaging with as much generosity as we can muster.
And I'll add, I think, when we die and go to heaven one thing that might surprise us is what history actually looks like. Like, who really influenced history? Who were the people that, and I think a lot of it will be the people that were not in textbooks. These people that were just doing work quietly, by themselves. And I think that will be a surprise. And then just to answer your question about what we can take away, just as the average person, we're not president of the United States, we're not, whatever, we're not leaders of organizations maybe. What can we do? And I do think there's a posture that the women learned that we can all apply. And that, when they came into this was not rhetoric, this was not strategic. They weren't trying to win converts even. They were coming to meet really just to meet each other where they really were and understand each other. And that is a radical move, because when you actually meet someone, you actually present yourself, right? And you learn a lot about who you are, you learn a lot about who they are, and you realize that things are very different than you imagined. And that's something you can do in your own head just by realizing that the people you disagree with are probably not as easily dismissed as you are used to doing. It's really easy just to see them as stupid, evil, whatever, right? And to just dismiss them. But when you actually are face-to-face with a real person that's intelligent, informed, what have you. Maybe they're not intelligent, maybe not informed. They're still a real person with real thoughts, and you realize that they're not so easily dismissed. And it just changes, the world changes when you adopt that posture, and you actually become someone who learns and becomes more nuanced, more interesting. So I'll just give one other example of this, which is in college, I remember writing an essay about Plato, and a bunch of students being like, oh, so stupid. I can't believe you believe these things. And that's not hard to do. There's things you can take and be like, wow, that's really ridiculous. But when you take the posture and realize that he's probably not stupid, right? And there's probably something here worth understanding, then you get something really, you actually meet Plato. Yeah. And you actually realize that there's something amazing here. You might disagree with, you might not be all on the whole Platonic whatever, but there's still something here that'll change you and inform you. And that is work that you can do even if you can't go and meet with people. You can just start adopting that posture.
And I really do appreciate the work that places like Grace Cathedral and I think especially other religious congregations are doing, because in some ways I do feel like the bridging approach is not that dissimilar from religious work, right? I think at their core, religions are always engaged in bridging people to each other and to the divine, and that's holy work, and that's work that you guys are already doing, and that we, I think a lot of people are invested in already that we can support.
Yeah, I feel that, the quote of knowing the people around you and what their different views are. I really do think there's something really to that.
Yeah.
And because you're right, there's no group that's fully of one mind about anything. But I keep thinking about this, and that is that a lot of what we're talking about is just face-to-face interactions, and there are just a lot of forces that are changing the way those interactions happen. So technological changes in particular, and I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about how we could better learn these technologies that we've been using that are new and that have been, I think, exacerbating our problems with polarization.
Well, yeah. So one of the problems I think on social media is that's a public forum most of the time, right? Most of the time, you have an audience, and it's really hard to avoid rhetoric and strategy, right? When you're sort of talking to someone, but you're also talking to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
That's what the women were all leaving to go into this room, because you can't have that audience, all of you guys. You can't be there for us to have, right? You can't have that audience if you're going to have this really interpersonal, particularly about contentious things where you're a leader of a group, right? You have to find ways to meet, even if you're not face-to-face, you're not in a public place. You're able to meet someone without having to perform. And I guess performance has to be subtracted out of the equation.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Yeah, and it reminds me actually, I want to be clear, I think there is a lot of value in activism. I think that's really important work in order to make changes, make vital changes, and protest against things that are really vile and wrong. And I do think that this sort of dialogue that we show in this film is also a necessary sort of countervailing effort in order to repair people who feel vilified or isolated or alienated in those really vital and important activist efforts.
This may be sort of similar to businesses that pollute a lot maybe have some responsibility, right, to be involved in cleaning and right, and so activists who pollute the rhetoric a lot, right, they're going and they're trying to make changes and they're causing fractures to do that. They have some responsibility to invest in the repair, right? If you're the one polluting, you need to be invested. So I think activists, and these were activists, this is what they were doing. They were trying to counter some of the necessary harm they were doing to advance their causes. And I think that's a good paradigm for all of us as activists to realize that if we're going to be activists, we have to be responsible too for the pollution we leave behind.
Yeah, that's great. I love what you said, Sarah, about just that Martin Luther King is like a symbol, a huge symbol, and very important. But maybe even more important are thousands of people that we never knew or never heard of. And we do meet some of them, like at Grace Cathedral. We have, these civil rights people who did incredible things years and years ago. But the two of you are engaged in this work yourself. So you are those hidden people who are trying to build bridges between the different extremes in our polarized society. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just what motivates you to do this ministry yourselves.
Well, I'll say the hidden people are sitting right here, so you can't see anything. What motivates us? Honestly, I think I realized that I had a lot of good friends in college, actually. I realized in college that I had a lot of good friends that thought very differently than me. And I thought there was just a real tragedy that people of one political opinion weren't seeing that these are really cool people that I like, right? And I think that was the kernel where I was like, I like these people a lot. And I actually tend to gravitate towards these people. And yet, I maybe believe over here, whatever. And I just think that experience was the kernel where I was like, this is a problem. And I think ever since then, I've been really passionate. I wrote some blog articles about it, and I was just trying to find a way to be involved.
Yeah, I think for me, there was two motivators. I'm a PhD student and a perpetual, as long as people are paying me, I'll continue going to school. And in my PhD program, there was a girl in my cohort who's very intelligent, studying early indigenous literature, who prays every day that abortion will end. And she would never air that opinion in our classes, even though it's her authentically held belief, for fear of being called out or kicked out of class, and that seemed, I think, like a failure to me of the university system, where we're supposed to have this exchange of ideas, and ideas are able to be aired and challenged. And so I think that really profoundly impacted me, and recognizing how more and more this sort of breakdown of the currency of ideas. And then I think the other place where I was really impacted is we, in our church setting, we had seen more and more of our friends leaving the pews. And these were intelligent, thoughtful, wonderful people who we would have much preferred to be sitting next to in Sunday school and Bible study, because they felt that their ideas and their perspectives and interpretations were not welcome. And I think that, again, that felt like a failure of the church system to provide a space for these ideas that didn't fit cleanly within the larger cultural narrative.
Yeah, thank you. One of the traditions we have at the cathedral is we take questions. So people write questions from the audience, and I read those questions. So Rebecca's going to be collecting those questions. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just film too, just why film is something that you've both chosen to work in. What was your experience of film as children? Was there something that you remember from your childhood about film or moving pictures that influenced the way that you gravitated toward this field?
Yeah, so Josh and I are both English majors. Yeah. We met working at the University Writing Center, and then we graduate, and remarkably, it's really hard to be a writer.
It is, but it's really important. You're professional humanities scholars, and we need professional humanities scholars.
Yeah.
And we do write.
Yeah, we write as well. But I think there is a realization that increasingly the main mode of communication in public spaces is moving pictures. And
honestly, part of it was mental health for me. She was still getting her PhD. No one would take me as a PhD student, apparently. I don't know. I couldn't get it. But,
I would have taken you if you had
it. Thanks. Sure. I appreciate it. But she was still going to school. I was trying to earn money. But writing is great, but it's also very isolating. It's you at a computer. And I wanted to be working with other people a little bit sometimes, right? And this was just a way. It was I can do the same sort of work. It's storytelling, but it's with others. And I think that was really attractive to me, that I didn't have to just be by myself. all day, every day, and so I was looking for that avenue.
And I do think it's been really great for our family. We have 2 little boys. We're a husband and wife filmmaker team. And it's been, I think, really healthy for our little 4-year-old to be presented with a number of very different people. We filmed in a variety of very different places and amongst very different populations.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
Well, just we often bring our kids with us. We didn't bring them here, but and we've done things, in ghettos with drug addicts, and we bring our kids with us, and they've been touched that we brought our kids. That's been something that has moved many people, that we're here with our kids in their home. So it's
great. When I went on sabbatical to Africa, and we met so many people we would never have met because we had small children with us.
Yeah,
and it was kind of
for real.
a door that opened up to our life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think bringing kids, especially when you have cameras about, just changes the dynamic. People become much more comfortable and I think, feel trusted and thus are more willing to trust you with their stories, which is the most remarkable part of documentary filmmaking.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so here's, from your report on this dialogue, can you read any of the answers from ProLife Voices? Okay, so can you report on any answers from ProLife Voices to this question? I understand, quote, I understand you hold a position of pro-life with respect for your, I'm sorry. I'm doing my best here. I'll be choosing all the questions that have the clearest handwriting. Okay, from your report on this dialogue, can you report on any answers from ProLife Voices to this question? Quote, I understand you hold a position of pro-life with respect to your position. Why do you feel justified telling another woman how to navigate her path? All right.
Yeah, so I think the question is, how would pro-life advocates answer that question?
Yeah.
Oh, no, was it pro-life?
Pro-life, yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's definitely a question they get a lot. It's a very common question.
Yeah, so again, these are 3 pretty individual women, so I think they would have different sorts of answers. Fran, she's a lawyer, and her position on abortion, I think, is deeply influenced by her belief in the law to protect the most vulnerable populations. She's also really involved in creating affordable housing laws for poor populations in Boston. And I think she's very Kantian in her ethos. I think ultimately she would say it's wrong to take human life, and there's no, that's her conjunction, her, what's the word that I'm looking for?
Yeah, her conviction.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say all these women are very involved in creating laws that they think better and protect life. And it's not just abortion, like she was saying, like affordable housing, poverty. And so it's not a unique move to try to create a law that makes life better or protects people, and so that's what they see that they're doing, is protecting life, protecting vulnerable communities.
Yeah,
and writing laws to help that happen.
And especially in a place like Boston, these pro-life organizations tend to be not as well funded as pro-choice organizations, but a lot of the funding that they do, I learned in the course of making this documentary, which I hadn't known. At least in Boston, a lot of their work revolves around fundraising for giving baby showers for pregnant mothers who are impoverished and doing daycare vouchers and that sort of work. So there's a lot of work that I didn't know goes on through these organizations.
Yeah. How do you deal with the plethora of misinformation in trying to bridge and negative dialogue? What techniques are helpful for good dialogue?
Yeah, some good questions. What was the first part of the question? Those techniques, and the first part was?
Yeah, how do you deal with the plethora?
Dealing with misinformation.
Yeah, misinformation.
Yeah, there's a lot of work out there to try to, we were just talking today about different AI techniques to try to deal with misinformation, disinformation. A lot of that's just how information is spread, and that's always changing, but tends to still be social media, and there's a lot of people intervening in that and trying to address that. I do think there's a fundamental problem, though, which is, there's a hurt below that that makes it potent, that makes disinformation potent, was when there are people that feel marginalized, isolated, not a part of a community. Like those are sort of more fundamental things that make that disinformation powerful. I would say there are people addressing that misinformation. We're more focused on that original hurt of division and things.
Yeah, and in terms of techniques to make dialogues possible, I think as much as you can, strong manning your opposition. Meet people's perspectives where they're strong rather than trying to find the weak points or poke holes. Like anybody can poke holes. That's not particularly interesting. I think if you want to learn something or greet your opposition in a way that you'll actually understand them better, I think finding the places where they're strong and greeting them there.
It's Last Black Man in San Francisco, right? Where they say, in order to hate San Francisco, you have to love it?
Yeah, you don't get to hate it unless you love it.
I feel like that was a great line that sort of captures like what it takes to really even critique a movement. Is first you have to really love it and get it first before your critiques are actually that powerful.
Yeah. Was it in your material? I read that in the South they say that if you're talking so much about our team, then you're really part of our team. Like there is a way in which we have to care in order to be able to have these conversations.
Yeah.
Okay, how do you? These were all the leaders. Is there a message for leaders?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I kind of said earlier that in some ways I feel like this is a message to leaders, right? And then in some way everyone's a leader within some realm. But, right, because these were all leaders and they were all engaged and they all learned something about their leadership that, like I said, like Nikki said, that the most important task of being a leader is understand the differences of opinions around you. And there's lots of ways that you can facilitate communication between subordinates or, so that they can have productive conversations. And in some ways, as a leader, you have power to create those environments. It's really hard as an individual, like just me by myself, creating those environments around me. But as a leader, it's actually, you're in a position where you can actually create environments where people present disagreements productively, where people that aren't able to express themselves get another chance to express themselves better. Right? Maybe they get shut down because they had a bad logical framework, but that doesn't mean that everything about it was wrong. And so you create environments where they get to show up again, and they don't just get shut down and pushed out. And that's a really important work of a leader.
Yeah, and I think that's true whether you're a leader of a movement, of a corporation, of a school, of a PTA group or HOA group. Like we all have, I think, communities of influence where we have influence, and doing as much work as you can within those communities to allow for pluralism of belief and for that pluralism to be expressed is important work.
At Grace Cathedral, we have a summer survey. So, if anybody has any things I hate the hymns they choose, whatever it is, there's a chance to speak out. And then we also have a town hall meeting in August, just to have, if people have concerns, they can raise them at that time. But I really
some great ideas. I think people
that's
could
really
take some of those ideas.
Yeah, it's funny because now it's so easy to do surveys in a way that, some technology can make it easier for us to communicate in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
For sure, and like to allow for maybe someone isn't willing to put their name to something, but you can create ways that people can still, you can find out what's there and then allow it to come out. This technology allows us to do that in new ways.
Yeah. So this person says, thank you. Maybe bridge building should be taught in our schools. It seems to be just as important as math and science. Kids model what they see. Have you ever heard of courses in bridge building like this refers to? Yeah,
I remember Andrew Sidorkin, who's in the film. You don't see him that much, but I had a really interesting conversation with him during our interview. And he studies education.
He's a dean of education at Sacramento State.
Oh yeah, right. I remember him.
Yeah, so he
was in for one section.
Yeah, he's just there for a second. It's actually a series. There's a longer where he's in more often. But he talked about how education hasn't, like most things, we've become more efficient with technology. But like, for example, plays. Like it takes just as many man-hours to run a play today as it did like back in Greece or Rome, right? It's like we haven't become technology's changed, but we haven't become more efficient.
Yeah.
Education's the same way. We're not more efficient educating. And so that's just, if like technology, like so much of so much of our focus on education is about like technology and almost like technological literacy, but that's not actually making it more efficient. And so like, what if that wasn't our exclusive focus? And instead we thought like, what is the actual work going on here? And in so many ways, the work going on is bringing children into a world of diversity and giving them skills to function and be happy and productive, right? Like that's the work that's going on here, and it's not efficient work. It's not something you can just throw a computer in front of, and it's going to happen. Like it's work that is all about this work. It's the work of people understanding, communicating, and that is something we really neglect in education. Often, instead we just technology. So I don't know. I think that's a good point that we need to not just be thinking technology and be thinking these really interpersonal skills as a really valuable part of what education is and can be.
And there are organizations doing that work right now.
Yeah, I definitely, the older I get, the more I appreciate people who kind of bring people together and can build bridges, and the less, I appreciate there's just like the sheer mental power that it takes to solve very complex problems.
Yeah.
So to the best of your knowledge, did any of the pro-life women have an abortion influence their pathway? What an interesting thought.
Yeah, so you don't get it in the feature, but in the series, which hopefully is out someday, you actually hear Nikki tell her abortion story, and it's the actual.
She's pro-choice.
Oh, sorry. She's pro-choice. Oh, I messed up the question, but I'm still going to say this. She tells her story, and it's actually from the meeting, so it's from the audio from the meetings. Yeah. You hear her tell the story. And there were other women in the group that had abortions.
It's an interesting group. Again, we talk about this more in the feature. So it's a group of 6 women. Of the 6 women who participated, 2 of them had children. And so I think, I don't know what exactly to say about that, but I think it is interesting, just the dynamic of that. And then
2 had abortions.
2 had abortions, and 2 had children.
Yeah.
And then one of the women, her sister had considered an abortion, and she felt very strongly that was a wrong thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and not all of this is in the documentary because it's not something we wanted to share. But,
right, completely.
But they all had very personal experiences with abortion.
Last year, I preached a sermon about abortion, and I was shocked by how many people came and approached me afterwards to talk about things that they'd never told anyone.
Yeah.
So it really, I think there's another thing about this, is that this isn't about things happening to those people out there. This is happening to us, you know.
And I'll say Barbara Thorpe, who was the president of ProLife Office of the Archdiocese of Boston, when she came in, she was the first lay leader. I don't know how that all works, but she was.
Yeah, she's not a nun.
Yeah, she's not a nun. She was just a person, but she was the leader of the office, the first person, and her mission was, what's it called?
Project Rachel. So it's a remarkable program where the purpose of the program is to, because the Catholic Church was so outspoken against abortion, there was a realization that women were getting abortions and then leaving the church and never coming back because they felt so condemned.
Or just not feeling that they were getting the support they needed.
Right, yeah. And so the work of Project Rachel was to create a space for those women to come and talk about their experience and say, like, you're still welcome here. Like, we want you here. And are you hurting? Can we help you heal? Are you glad? That's fine. Let's talk about it. To just try to re-welcome these women back into the fold.
Because it's remarkable statistics, actually, with abortion, where there's a surprising number of people who think it's wrong but would get an abortion in like these in certain scenarios, and other people that think it's completely fine but would never get an abortion. It's like the difference between belief and action on both directions is actually quite startling. And so, Project Rachel is really a way of bridging that difference, where there are people here that think it's wrong, but did it, and people that think it's okay but wouldn't do it, and we need to like have a way to welcome them and to create an environment where they can exist together and receive, sort of pastoral support.
Care.
We have another question. As a graduate of Barnard College, a women's school who also took classes at Columbia, I can testify that a group of women in conversation and communication is, that women can communicate very differently, so that's good.
Yeah.
What wisdom about speaking amidst polarized political times can you share for a grassroots activist here today?
Yeah, there's a really lovely story that didn't make it in of Madeline McComish, the head of Planned Parenthood, Mass Citizens for Life. And she's just like the loveliest person. She's like this tall and like short black hair. And she tells a story of being at a protest, or at a march, and there is a counter protest. And she's doing her march, and she like looks out and sees this counter protester who's getting a sunburn. And so she steps aside and she's like, "Would you like some sunscreen?"
She has a little fanny pack.
And so she like pulls some sunscreen out of her march fanny pack, and the counter protester starts putting it on. And the counter protester says something like, "Why do you care so much? The world's too populated anyways." And Madeline says, "But that's not so. Humans are the most wonderful thing." And it's this moment of like humanity literally in the middle of opposing activisms, right? And I think seeing that and how that is possible, even when we're in the midst of our activism work, I think is really powerful.
And I'll just say that there's a place for activism. Like, these women were all activists, and they used rhetoric and strategy, right? But they're, again, this kind of goes back to that pollution thing, but they also, because of that, felt that they were doing something that they needed to worry about, like they needed to repair, and that was part of this work. And so you're not going to be able to have like this perfect world where activism and dialogue coexist perfectly, and you never say anything offensive to anyone or disagree. That's never going to exist. Like, maybe at this moment you're an activist, but if so, just make sure that you're also looking this way and realizing that there's work to be done over here too.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit just about what you see in the future for yourselves, and what kind of projects you might work on in the future. You're probably lining them all up. When we interviewed Ken Burns on the forum, he had like 17 different projects that were coming up after this. So maybe you have zero, though.
Yeah.
Then you can just talk about your hopes for the world.
Yeah, no, we have several projects.
Do you want to talk about Boys Town?
Yeah, we have one documentary that's pretty much finished now, that deals with Boys Town, which was started by Father Flanagan, a Catholic priest. We actually got in touch with them through American Tragedy, our last documentary. Yeah. And they really take a behavioralist model to sort of troubled boys. And it's no longer like Catholic. It's now like non-denominational. But they really just focus on behaviors instead of seeing bad behavior as like a moral failure. They see it as a skill deficit. And they really just see behavior and teach skills. And that's like exclusively what they do. And they've had amazing success at helping troubled youth, change the trajectory of their life, way more than almost any other intervention. So we have a documentary sort of talking about that. What else are we doing?
So as I mentioned, I'm a PhD student. I study 20th century literature and theology around the Book of Job. And so we're making a movie that's a retelling of the Book of Job.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. The Stephen Mitchell translation. I remember reading that when I was like 18 years old.
Yeah, yep.
What fun.
We have a few other book projects, but...
Oh my gosh, what are the other book projects?
We're changing the CPS system.
Great,
that's
good.
A long story.
Yeah.
Is that the flyer for...
Yeah, so
yeah,
thank you. Yes.
Sure.
So today at 2 p.m. at Glide Memorial Church just down the hill, we're screening the abortion talks at an interfaith screening event. So if you're around, please come. We would really love to have you all there.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say next.
Great, go for it.
But it's been wonderful having you guys. I can't believe our time's up. It's just went by so fast. I have so many more questions about technology, about interviewing techniques, about like reenactments.
Yeah.
I have a lot of questions, so we'll have to save them for the next time you guys are back.
Sounds great. Maybe you can do a screening here sometime, and we would love that.
That'd be great. Yeah,
we'd love that.
Definitely in our future for sure.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be great.
Please join us next Sunday when my guest will be Caroline Alexander, the classicist, best-selling author, and the first woman to publish a translation of Homer. We'll be talking about her translation of the Iliad, about the relevance of the story today, and the enduring power of poetry. You're very welcome to join us at the 11 o'clock service today. And then I encourage you to see the film at Glide Memorial Church at 2 o'clock p.m. We appreciate your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including online at gracecathedral.org. Josh and Sarah, what a pleasure. It's been such a blessing to meet you. There's so many things that you guys both said today that are going to stay with me for a long time.
Thanks, Malcolm. We're so glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.